road if there's traffic coming. They have, you know, minded it really well. They've obviously, it was in the competition for the Golden Mile, so every bit of litter, everything like that was all picked up off it. And here was a wonderful walk. Now this was 10-15 years ago. I mean, how much more today with COVID restrictions and people confined to going 5 kilometers, how much more pleasant is that than something that's neglected? And yet it's not the tropical rainforest, it's not the coral reefs, it's what people have in the area beside this in Tipperary, and what a pleasant vista that is. So that competition really inspired people, and other counties copied it afterwards. Westmeath and Meath and Roscommon, other counties copied this idea of golden miles or pride of place miles or whatever they call them, various things, to encourage rural people to be proud of the roads between where one village was and another, and indeed to get together in groups, which they did, to make it even more presentable and hopefully win the competition when the competition happened. We're looking here now at Diamond Hill over in Connemara, and we're looking at a different habitat again. I mean, this thing looks like a Paul Henry painting, but in fact, what we're looking at here, I don't know whether you can see my arrow or not, but here is actually an oak woodland. This is an oak forest all along here. Again, it's early in spring. There's no leaves on the oak trees. This is an ash tree in the foreground. There's no leaves on that either. And there's Diamond Hill in the background. And this is Blanket Bog up on the hillsides, and a few fields with hedgerows in between. This is the local environment there. And again, it has its beauty. It has its charm. We have the lake here. We have different creatures again in the lake. And indeed, if we look at Blanket Bogs in more detail, we're looking at it more closely here, and you can see how blanket bogs are actually formed. You have this idea of hummocks and hollows. So we're looking at pools here of water, and then areas where you're above the water, where the turf is forming, where the peat is forming. And these blanket bogs are actually practically confined to Ireland at this stage. I mean, the next nearest place where you get any appreciable amounts of them is actually in Russia, because we did have them in other parts of Europe, but they were removed. They were harvested for peat, the same way as the forests were removed for people to agriculturally farm the land. The boglands in other places were actually removed for fuel, and indeed that this same approach happens in Ireland too. My friend went to talking about the Antarctic. She went to the Antarctic on her honeymoon. Well, for some, isn't it? But anyhow, when she got to the south of Chile, they had to wait for a day or two to get the boat across, and they were being entertained by whoever was in charge of minding them, and they were being brought to see a bog, the only bog in the southern hemisphere, they were told. And of course, Breda was only one of very few Irish people on this. I think herself and the husband were the only 2 Irish people on that particular expedition. But of course, when the person in charge discovered that they were from Ireland, they were sort of apologising for the bog. And Breda said, God, she wouldn't cross the road to look at the bog in Ireland, you know, because it was such a Mickey Mouse affair relative to the bogs that we had, that she was used to seeing in Ireland. So, you know, again, familiarity breeds contempt. You know, what's a bog for? Only throwing out mattresses and getting rid of your rubbish into, or, you know, draining it if you could at all. Appreciation of it. So this idea of your local habitat is so very important. You were talking about the different things you're doing with An Burren Bio, but the first thing that has to happen is that the people who are looking at this have to appreciate that their local habitat is important. They have to know the value of it. They have to want to have it, because otherwise they will only consider it a waste of space, good agricultural land that they can't have, or whatever, you know, misnomers that are put out there. Because if you don't consider your natural environment to be important, well, then what is the point of talking about it? I mean, you have to say this is a really valuable place, it's fairly good, and we must improve it. But if you consider this to be, there's a lump of a wet bog, and the quicker we get it drained and, you know, something else done with it, the more we can benefit from cows or whatever. That's what you want to be imposing to look at it through those prisms. And I mean, this particular fellow is the red diver, the northern diver with the red-throated diver. You can see the lovely red mark on his throat. And in one of those bogs up in Donegal, I got that picture last summer, not last summer patently, but the summer before that, because it's one of the few nesting places for this bird as far south. I think it's the most southerly one because it's a much more northern bird. So your old Bog Land, the old Shuck, the place you might be saying what, is actually a habitat for the red-throated diver, you know, a bird that absolutely needs peace and quiet and this particular kind of habitat to breed in. This is County Meath, and this is good rich farming land, as you can see, and we're looking at the bocage landscape. I used to tell my students this was a bocage landscape. I love showing off with big words, but a bocage landscape is actually all of these hedgerows that you can see. So the farmer is harvesting his barley. He has his hedgerows there, and all of you can see the different bales of the straw that's left over. But the reason I was pointing it out, I was asking my third level students, if I took you in a helicopter and put you out, you could be in any European country, I say, how would you know it was Ireland? How would you know it was France? How would you know wherever it was? And of course they were they were saying they'd look at the signpost and they'd ask the local people, and I would say, no, there's nothing to do with that. You mustn't be looking at the signpost and you mustn't be talking to the local people. Just look at the landscape. How would you know what country you were in by looking at the landscape? How would you know it was Ireland? Of course, you don't know because you're here in Ireland, but in actual fact, there are no hedgerows in Europe. They don't have a bocage landscape. They have clumps of trees, plenty of trees, but their fields are not divided like our fields are with these. This is history on the landscape. This is a result of land division, of people getting their land back after landlords and things that were deprived of it, and putting boundaries around their fields, around their bits of land that they got and they owned. And we get this in Britain, we get it in Scotland, we get it in Ireland, and we get it in Brittany and France, and we get it nowhere else. This bocage landscape is very much particular to what we might laughingly call these islands. I don't know what we're supposed to call them. Can't be calling them the British Isles anyway. But and what it is, it's a reflection of the change in ownership of land. So your local landscape isn't just a heap of geography, a heap of biology. It reflects the history of the place as well. And the amount of value that these hedgerows have, particularly in an area like Meath, where there is so much agriculture going on. These are wildlife corridors. These are the remains of the woodlands that were there formerly. You've good alkaline soil, so you're looking at ash and elm. The elms are probably gone since the Dutch elm disease, but these would have been ash elm hedgerows, and the ash are hanging in there still, and the various hawthorns and hazel and trees like that associated with that kind of soil, and then all the associated flora underneath, and the insects and the birds that use these as wildlife corridors, not to speak of foxes and badgers and hedgehogs and other creatures that can't go marching across fields like that, but have these continuous line of hedgerow as an important part of the landscape. So by knowing this and by appreciating this, if you were so inclined, you would be that kind of farmer that wouldn't remove every last hedgerow, wouldn't say, I'm not wasting space on a hedge when I would have a bigger field. I mean, the fields are big enough, but if you don't appreciate the huge importance, like well punching above its weight, that a hedgerow has in an area like this, you wouldn't see the importance of keeping it there for the biodiversity, for the shelter for animals if you have animals in your field, for the impact it has on the water level, on the water table, preventing flooding. All of these things are actually controlled by the hedgerows. So appreciating them in the first place, understanding that they're important, is vital so that they can be conserved. Now I'm showing you this map here now, and the reason why I'm showing you this map is because what I'm showing you here is a particular type of local habitat that we only have no, never mind the bocage landscapes. This is even more esoteric, if you like. It's landscape that we have in Ireland and in Scotland on the west coast. And what I'm talking about, of course, is macair. Now, macair is an Irish word. Macara, it means a plain, and it's a flat sand dune. Now, let's see if I can have some pictures of it. And this is a really good example. This is Dogs Bay over in Connemara. And you have it's what they call a tombola, apparently. And whatever bit of land is sticking out, the sea is coming at it from the two sides, giving you two lovely beaches. But the macair is actually sand dunes formed in an area that's so windy and so windswept that the dunes can, like on the east coast of Ireland, if you were walking along by Curracloe, if you were walking along by British Bay, or you were going along by Bull Island or Baltray, or any of that east coast of Ireland, your sand dunes are dunes. They're hills. You go up and down the dunes. You have the little dunes at the beginning, and then you have the four dunes, then you have the primary dunes and the secondary dunes, then you have the golf course. It's always the bloody golf course. But you have the natural way that they're built up, because the sand is retained by the roots of the marram grass and builds it up into dunes. But on the west coast, there's so much wind fighting against this, that you do have your sand dunes, but they're flat. They're the macara, the plain. We have macara rorty, which is different places all around the coast. Macara rorty's up in Donegal, and the word macair, which is an English word now, I mean, that's the geologic or the whatever you call it, geographical term for this macair. It actually refers to the fact that it's a plain, and because it's just on the west coast, on the Atlantic side of both Ireland and Scotland, you have a completely different fauna here as well. I'm just looking at a close up there of the plants. And you can see the beautiful, I mean, the thing is calcareous, it's all sandy. So you have sand-loving plants there. I'm looking at an orchid, I'm looking at various dandelions, I'm looking at ladies' bedstraw, the yellow one there, there's clovers, there's wild carrot, there's blue ones there as well. They're probably violets, pansies from the seashore. I mean, if you did a square on that, you'd probably get 50 or 60 species, no bother at all in that. So the richness of that is absolutely incredible. It hasn't been cultivated, it hasn't been enriched, it hasn't been fertilized, it hasn't even gotten turned into a golf course. So this area then has a huge variety of wildflowers. People are forever trying to make wildflower meadows, and here's one that naturally exists on poor soil, windy conditions, life is hard, and here you have them all cheek by jowl. Grass, of course, is the big bully. Grass loves light, grass loves rich soil. If you have soil and you're trying to have a wildflower meadow, your grass will rush in and hog all the light and take all the space, and the poor wildflowers get the boot. Whereas if the grass can't do so well because the soil doesn't contain enough nitrogen for it, then you're going to get your wildflowers here. So this macair is a wonderful place for this, very close turf. It doesn't have to be grazed, it doesn't have to be mowed, so you get birds like choughs, which are red-legged jackdaws, if you like, and cogcustarag they call them, and they're probing this short turf, looking for invertebrates to feed upon. So it's a whole different habitat there, and this on an Irish level is our local habitat. This is a lovely bay. This is a sand dune system again, and this time the sand dune system is right up against cliffs. So you have a lot of sea spray coming in. This is actually, if you look at it, is the Blasket Islands. It's Blasket Moor, and up on the hill behind. I managed to get out there a couple of years ago, and this wonderful, they call it on Thrawbon or on Thrawmore, and you can see why it's so. And you never go swimming on a beach that's that clean, because there's some tide coming in and out and washing that out and about. So the local, I mean, this is the kind of coastline we have on the west coast of Ireland, that the poor devil over in Poland, his tongue was hanging out to come and see, because he wouldn't get one of those. He wouldn't get one of those over in Poland. Now, I'm sure this is familiar to all of yourselves here. This is a piece of the burn, and again, this is a different type of grassland, if you like. Now, I spent summers, weeks with summertime out on on Inishman or Inishmore or Inisheer on the Aran Islands with Con O'Rourke. And Con O'Rourke was a wonderful man. The poor man died there last year. And he had this whole concept of, you had the teachers, the trainee teacher, he was from the Institute of Biology, and it was through the auspices of the Institute of Biology that he used to do this. The trainee teachers have to learn Irish, and they spend a month there in the summertime or a week in September or time at Easter, whatever the different training courses are. And the teachers, mostly indeed from the east of Ireland, the particular ones that go to the Aran Islands, go over there to learn the Irish language. And Con was of the opinion that if you're out there learning the language in a wonderful place, like because the Aran Islands are the same sort of terrain as the Burren, well, then they should be learning the plants, the flora. They should be learning about the seashore. They should be learning about, excuse me a moment, they should be learning about the wildlife that lives there. They should be learning about it. And of course, they should be learning about this as Gaeilge, because they're out there learning Irish. So as there aren't too many people who can tell you about the plants as Gaeilge, I used to be roped in to do this. So it didn't take much persuasion to rope me in. What a wonderful place to be going. And I'd be there with the teachers from the east coast of Ireland, and then I thought, well, now they can learn some plants and stuff while they're there. And I'd be showing them things like, say, the bloody cranesbill, for example. The bloody cranesbill is a member of the geranium family, and I would be telling them that this is a huge, big blood red one, and it's absolutely gorgeous, and it only occurs in these limestone areas. But you know, it's a relation of the one that you get in every hedgerow in Ireland, Herb Robert. And then I realised that the teachers didn't know what Herb Robert was, so they weren't going to fall dead seeing the bloody cranesbill. So what? I mean, if you don't know the common things, how can you appreciate the rare things? So this was a salutary lesson for me, really, to actually say, I'm sending these kids back. I'm sending these teachers, I shouldn't be calling them kids, I'm sending back to teach in their schools in Dublin or in Louth or in Westmeath or wherever they were from. And they don't know the ordinary things that are in their hedges. And then, so there was no point in showing them the wonderful special things for the Aran Islands, unless those teachers were going to be teaching in the Aran Islands, because I couldn't highlight that this was a rarer form of a common thing when they don't know the common thing. This is me out with a crowd of school children in Dublin, and we've been looking under stones, and we've been collecting snails and slugs and ordinary things like this, and handing them around and letting them feel them and hold them is the kind of thing that you really have to do. You really have to start at the beginning. And the common things, I mean, things are wonderful if you don't know what they are, and to be shown something, it doesn't matter whether it's Herb Robert or whether it's a dandelion or something like this. If you don't know it, and now you do, you've gone and you've made a learning, you've made a discovery. I mean, you see all the time now, because we have COVID, and you have people out walking their 5K. This is actually a picture of the Dodder in Dublin, the river that is south of the Liffey, parallel to the Liffey, flowing into the sea, just into Dublin Bay as well. And it's a river as opposed to the canal, and rivers are always wilder places. And honest to God, you're supposed to be keeping 2 meters distance from anybody and anybody else. And I live near to this part of the Dublin, and in Dublin for 40 years, and I've walked this up and down, and you wouldn't see too many people, and you'd be grand, and you could see the wildlife. There's a heron standing on a rock looking at the Dodder, hoping something will go by that he can nab. Now, of course, you can hardly get space to walk up and down. It's like Piccadilly Circus at rush hour, because the 20,000 people that live along the banks of the Dodder are using this for their walks, and it is absolutely great to see so many people suddenly appreciating that the river that flows through their built-up area is still so wild that you get trees like in those and behind it, and that you get birds like herons, and indeed you get kingfishers, you get birds like what do we call them, the grey wagtails, you get dippers. All of these are on the Dodder, and not alone are people walking, but they're stopping and they're paying attention and they're trying to get pictures of things and they put them up on various websites and they want to know what they are, and suddenly they're interested. And yet you could walk along another river that's polluted and you wouldn't see a thing at it. So it's great that suddenly, instead of just a few mad people that go out walking along rivers in the middle of the morning or whatever, that this place is packed with people walking up and down and really enjoying the fact that there's such a lot of wildlife in the middle of the city with 1 million people still there along the River Dodder. It's a very short river. It rises in the Wicklow Mountains itself, and the Liffey rise beside each other. But the Liffey takes the scenic route to the sea, goes off the other way and round through Kildare and back into Dublin. And it's 80 miles, or I don't know how many kilometres that is, but this one is only 30 something miles. And on Dothra, the name for it in Irish means the floody one. So if it rains and there's a big heap of water coming off the mountains above in Wicklow, it comes into the Dodder, thunders down, and the whole place floods. I mean, that's why it got its name. And they've been doing huge amounts of works to stop it flooding people's houses, but they can't really tame it. It isn't a canal, and as a consequence, it is full of wildlife that just won't lie down and be managed. And by putting paths along it, by making greenways, by letting people see it and appreciate what is in their local environment is really very important. Now I'm looking here at a coniferous wood, and this is a wood that has evergreen trees. None of these trees are native to Ireland, and you get a lot of sort of perverse attitudes to trees like this. You know, like they're the spawn of Satan and they have the countryside destroyed and all this kind of carry on. Now, there's a couple of things I want to say about that. So she with her tree council hat on, given that next week is National Tree Week. Now, trees, of course, are our biggest plants, and like any other plant, they carry out
Hi, Eanna. We have lost sound.
leaves of
You might.
trees. Sorry.
We've lost sound there about 30 seconds ago. You might maybe turn your camera off just for a little while, and I'd say that might
I'll
fix
get if I can find it now. I'll end the show for the moment.
Yeah.
I'll turn myself off. I'll stop the video. So screen sharing has stopped as the shared window is closed. I'll open the shared window now and see, can we go on again? Let's see what happens. Share. Are we sharing? We are, yeah.
We are, yeah.
Okay, and I'll go from the current slide. Are we there? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Now, can you hear me better now?
It sounds better already, yeah.
Oh, excellent. That's great. So I've just, you won't see my wonderful face anymore, but we'll get over that somehow. Now, I'm talking about this woodland, and I'm just saying that trees carry out. I was just talking about the idea that sometimes people think that really we shouldn't allow Sitka spruce, we shouldn't allow evergreen trees to be growing here at all. And I was going to make a few comments on that. And one is that trees carry out photosynthesis. They split the carbon dioxide molecule in the atmosphere. They store the carbon in their bodies as timber, and the oxygen is for us to breathe. And all trees do this. And because they're long-lived, a lot of carbon is stored in them. And they are the only way of getting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We're busy putting it in by burning fossil fuels. It goes in by decomposition as well. And the only way to get it out at the moment is by photosynthesis. The chemists haven't come up with anything else. And we know climate change is happening rapidly because of the increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we've cut down half the trees of the world since people have started to do this. So half of the world's forests have vanished. So Ireland at 11% of cover has the lowest amount of trees in Europe, unless you count Iceland, which is above the tree line. So ourselves and Malta have about 11%. Even Britain, God help us, has 12%. And then the European average is 38%. And up places like Sweden and Finland have 68%, 70% of their countries covered in forests. So trees are good in that sense. Now we are looking, so from a point of view of photosynthesis, evergreen trees in Ireland work twice as fast as deciduous trees. The evergreen trees, because we have such a mild climate, I mean, if it goes -2, 4 days in a row, we're complaining, writing to God, telling him to stop this nonsense, to give us back our good weather. We have no idea about -20 or -30 or 40, like they would have in places like Canada and Siberia and places like that. So our trees can grow all the year round if they have leaves, if they can photosynthesize, and our evergreen trees do. So if you're comparing an oak tree and the Sitka spruce tree, in 40 years' time, the Sitka spruce will have sequestered, will have taken out of the atmosphere twice as much carbon as your oak tree will have. Now, obviously, the oak tree will continue to grow to its full length, and at 80 years' time, it'll have the same amount of carbon stored in it as your Sitka spruce has. But of course, the point is, and I know this very well, that our Sitka spruce trees are natives of British Columbia. They're brought in here and planted as plantations. They're all the same age, they're all the same species, and the amount of biodiversity in forests like that is very low, because once the canopy closes, no light gets in and there's no plants growing on the ground, as you can see, and little enough food then for animals to live there. So from a point of view of biodiversity, these are not anything like as good as forests of native Irish species of ash and oak and hazel and hawthorn and things like this. These are much better to have for biodiversity. So the point is that we have these forests and they're giving employment to 12,000 people who mainly live in rural areas, harvesting and making timber. Now, since we got our independence in 1921, probably the 1930s and 40s, by the time they got going, they began to plant trees because we had even fewer trees. We only had about 2 or 3% of Ireland covered with trees by 1900. So there needed to be trees planted. And in the 1940s and 50s, when people knew no better, trees were planted on areas where they shouldn't have been, on blanket bogs, on places. I think it was Devil Area, he of the Fianna Fáil party, this wonderful, wonderful man who saved Ireland from Hitler and I don't know what not he didn't do. He wasn't much good of an ecologist because he had no idea. His idea was, and he said this, and this was the policy of Fianna Fáil at the time, you shouldn't plant trees on land that's good enough for agriculture. You shouldn't be wasting good agricultural land planting trees on it. And this was in the time when you needed to be growing as much crops as possible. So trees were planted on land that was useless, as was so considered, places like Blanket Bog and things like this, of course, which was a terrible thing to do. First of all, the trees didn't grow properly because the soil wasn't good enough for them. And secondly, then they actually drained the bogs and caused the bogs to lose carbon into the atmosphere. But people copped on, education happened, and this has not happened for 40 years. For 40 years, there has been no planting on Blanket Bog, and yet people go along with this misguided idea that the government are planting trees all the time on Blanket Bog. It is not happening. They are taking them down, they are harvesting the ones that are there, and the regulations have all changed, and no trees are planted on Blanket Bogs any longer. They're planted on mineral soils, they're planted in areas where they can grow. But here's your woodland. This is what it looks like, and again, it's the actual natural environment of many people who are in the areas where these are. And by pressing for when the trees are harvested for the timber, that the replacement is done in a much more environmentally friendly way, the influence that local people can have is very good. The regulations are to let more light in, to have more glades, to have areas with no trees planted at all, to have the boundaries with deciduous trees and that sort of thing. And this is the way permissions are given for forests to be planted now. I'm looking at bogland, and this is again another area. Our bogs, as I was saying earlier, our boglands are again a very, very familiar habitat. We have two sorts of bogs in Ireland. We have raised bogs and we have the blanket bogs that I showed you earlier. Now, the raised bogs are bogs that filled into lakes that happened after the Ice Age. We had the Ice Age, the ice all melted and drained away, but it couldn't drain away in places where there were hollows. So we ended up with lots of lakes. I mean, there was the Lake of Allen in the middle of of Kildare, lots of these pools and puddles and lakes in County Westmeath, and over the centuries they filled in with vegetation. So you can see there, looking at that aerial picture of the raised bog, the good landscape, the bocage landscape around with farming, good farming land, and then this area in the middle where you had your raised bog. And you can see what's been happening to the raised bog. It's been cut away. There's very little actual vegetation left, a bit there in the middle, still in the centre of it. But all of the borders, all of the bits around have all been done, taken away in stripes and burnt for fuel. And this has been happening. I don't think we've hardly got a raised bog left in Ireland that hasn't been drained or interfered with in some way. Now, the raised bogs are much less frequent and abundant than the blanket bogs, which happen subsequently. And these are filled in lakes, so you could have up to maybe 30 meters of peat, of turf in the center of those. So again, in the misguided 40s, when ecology wasn't the thing and Ireland was poor, these were our indigenous fuels. We didn't actually have coal, we didn't have oil, we didn't have gas, we didn't know anything about that. So these were our indigenous fuels. So not only were people burning them because they needed fuel to keep them warm, but they were also harvested in order to burn for electricity. So here you have a raised bog that has been stripped and cut by Bord na Móna, because the Bord na Móna were set up as the organisation to actually harvest turf from bogs, and then a lot of this turf then was supplied to the ESB, and we had peat burning stations generating electricity. And the efficiency of these is about 22% of these peat burning stations, because the turf is so wet and the amount of electricity you get off them. I mean, you consider burning something as concentrated as natural gas, you have an efficiency of about 80%. You can see what a waste it was in that sense from a point of view of efficiency. But it was an indigenous fuel. There was no mass put on the bog. There was no importance attributed to it. The sense of appreciation, your local place wasn't there, your local landscape, and jobs were gone, jobs were given to people had livelihoods, and the villages were like Rochford Bridge in County, is it Westmeath that Rochford Bridge is in, was actually built for the workers on the bogs around there by Bord na Móna, and it gave huge amounts of employment at the time. But what it did, of course, was expose all of this carbon, all of this, because that's what you're looking at essentially. It's not coal, it's not oil, it's not gas, but it's plants, dead plants that lived and died, took carbon from the atmosphere and didn't decompose because of the acid conditions and the wet conditions that it was laid down under. And as a result, there were huge carbon reservoirs, carbon sinks. Now we know better, and of course we have problems now with trying to convince people not to be doing this any longer and let them go back to being areas which can work to save our world. Now we're getting there. The Bord na Móna are not going to make any more turf for electricity. The electricity stations, the two peat burning stations that were left, have been closed down. Bord na Móna peat briquettes are being phased out as well. So they do know, and they're stopping all of this now. So, the work that has been done trying to point out to people how important our local environment is beginning to get traction. We can't be always looking at the glass half empty. I mean, look at this now, for example. I think this is a great picture. Is a road in Germany. You can see the date. I've left the date on it on purpose. This is 2006. Now, this was when I was being the president of Untashka, and I would be pointing out this in lectures I was giving, saying, look what they can do in Germany. They have this green bridge. So you have stuff over here on the right, and you have stuff over here on the left, wildlife, and they can go over and back across this green bridge, and they're not being milled by the cars. Now, this was at the time when they were putting this road through the Glen of the Downs in County Wicklow, the M11 as it is now. That was a nature reserve on both sides of the road. It was one of the few bits of ash woodland that were left. It was in the valley of the Glen of the Downs, and you had woodland on both sides and a road going through it. And this road was being upgraded to a motorway, which, as you know, has happened. But they put actually a wall down the middle of the motorway. So if you were a poor unfortunate badger that wanted to visit a girlfriend on the other side and tried to go across the road, I mean, even if you didn't get killed by the cars, you were stuck against this wall up the middle. And I was trying to sort of at that point say, can we not do something like this? Put the motorway if you must. If you raise across one side to the other at least, which would give us wildlife corridors. Well, they picked themselves up off the floor laughing at the good of such a stupid thing. And look at this one. Now this is I'm sure you know the you Burren Bio people. This is the what is it, the M18, the motorway that goes down from Galway down to Limerick. And here is the Green Bridge across that. Isn't that great to see? And they've actually done it now. I know it's 2020 or whenever they opened this a couple of years ago, maybe 15 years after the other picture. 20, well, not 15 because it's opened a while. But that's a green bridge going across to enable bats and wildlife on one side of the road to go across to the other, because birds and owls and everything get hit with cars because they're flying across motorways. And they've done it. They've done it in County Clare. They've actually, so, you're not always pushing a stone up the hill to fall back on top of you. I mean, they did it in Germany in 2006. It was standard practice. But we get to do it here now, and we have to welcome such a thing. Now I'm looking at another thing, how we appreciate or don't appreciate our landscape. Now we're up on a hill and we're looking down across the north of County Mayo, looking out towards the sea, and you can see all the houses there. Now I'm going to show you a map of this. So here's the map. And we're looking at this national primary route, this big red line that you can see going across here. This is the road going across. Now you can see all of these blue things all over the place. Now these blue things are actually septic tanks, because this is all ribbon development. These are all houses in the countryside. They're not serviced by any kind of mains. So in order to dispose of their waste, they have to put up septic tanks in order to do this. Now this is the hill up here. This is Croagh-Patrick. This is Morriscree Park if you're going to climb. And you can see all these rivers, everything else, all flowing out into the sea. And every one of these septic tanks are holes in the ground into which the waste goes from the people's houses. Now, they're meant to be managed because a septic tank does actually work if it's managed properly. But when they tried to bring in regulations about septic tanks and ask people to monitor them and see how they were working, well, they came to Dublin and marched up and down outside the door sitting on toilets, no less. Telling you, I won't be swimming on the White Strand. I mean, the bacteria, if they don't break down in the septic tank, because you're putting, what do you put into your toilet to keep it clean? Domestos kills all known germs dead. And so does all these toilet ducts and all the other bloody things. And because they're bleaches, they do actually do what it says on the bottle. But you need your bacteria. I mean, you're not eating your dinner out of the toilet. Why are you killing all your germs dead? The germs are needed in the septic tank to break down the bacteria, because that's what to break down the sewage, to break down the bacteria, to break down this. The bacteria feed on the sewage, because that's what they do. They decompose it, break it all down so that there's no pollution going into the groundwater. But if you've killed all your bacteria by putting in your bleach, then your sewage doesn't get broken down and it goes off into the groundwater and pollutes the area. And this is the point I try to make all the time. People can live in rural areas, of course they can. I'm not saying they can't, but the way they dispose of their water really has to be a vital thing. You really have to understand how it works. And if you understand how it works, then do you really want to be contributing to polluting the area in which you live, polluting the water, polluting the beaches, polluting the levels of things like this? And yet, when you try to point this out, people don't want to hear. They think you're opposing their house and people are entitled to do what they want on their own land. But the techniques are there to do it right. Might cost a bit more, but is it important enough to do? I mean, here's some place down in County Kerry, and again you can see the same scatter of one-off houses all over the place. And again, because they're not in a village, they're not in an urban area, there's not a service sewage station taking away all the waste. This is what's actually happening. So this is really one of the reasons that inspired me to write my latest magnum opus, this Our Wild World, to explain how the world works. Because I really do feel if people really understood how the world worked, then they might be more in favor of doing things to stop damaging the world in which they lived. And like charity, it has to begin at home. Charity, home, they tell us. And so when you look at climate change, you look at all of these terrible things and you think, so what can I do? And yet your local environment is important. I'm really inspired in a way by the photographs that come in since this wretched COVID. And people, as you know, are very much confined to their own 5Ks, and they walk out in their own 5Ks, and they're paying more. Some of them are still marching around with their headphones on and going to get their 10,000 steps, and they don't, if they saw anything, it'd be a complete miracle. But lots of people are not like that, and various organisations have competitions for photographs. And there was one in Limerick I was judging there last summer, and these were various things that they were submitted as entrants. And this was somebody, as you can see, the irises is just along by the water, and they're watching the local fox going by, and there's the local fox, and that's in their 5K, that's in their local area. Look at the enrichment that's happening. Here's something even more mundane. Somebody's out in the garden and the shovel is just lying there. And yet they are so switched on to the local environment where they are that not only do they see the snail, and lots of gardeners feel snails are the enemy, but these people who've taken this picture are so enthralled with the beauty of the snail, they wait until it's in focus, they get its four horns out, its shell, it's moving up along the handle of the shovel. And of course, it's part of the biodiversity of the garden. It's a herbivore, it's eating plants, and in turn then it's providing food for hedgehogs, providing food for birds like thrushes who can pick it up and eat it. I mean, very few birds can eat snails, but thrushes know to bait it off the ground and break the shell and eat the contents of it. Here's a flower, and we're looking here at a bee. And again, of course, we're all very concerned about our pollinators. We're very concerned about having enough food for them. This is the time of year now when the bumblebees come out. This is a white-tailed bumblebee. And what do bees want? Well, they're the only pollinators really that actually want pollen. Most of our pollinators or other insects want nectar. They consider the flowers to be pubs, as it were, and they're going to the pub for a drink, for a piece of nectar. Pubs they're not much good at pubs really, even though they're open. You only get one mouthful in each, so you have to fly to a whole lot of them in order to get enough nectar to keep you going if you're a butterfly or a hoverfly. And of course, the flowers aren't giving away their food for nothing. They're not Egypts, and they have the pollen right out of the front of the flower that hits the pollinator on the head. So if your butterfly is going from flower to flower, it'll carry the pollen from one to another. Whereas in the case of your bumblebee, the bees and the honeybees actually collect pollen on their pollen baskets to bring back and feed their young. So they'll be visiting flowers for pollen and they'll be visiting flowers for nectar. So again, having your environment with suitable flowers are the important thing. I mean, people were absolutely amazed, or some people were, I'm sure some people weren't, to discover that in fact bees can't see red. Their eyes are tuned to different wavelengths to ours. They can actually see stuff in ultraviolet, which we can't, but their vision only comes down as far as green. So things that are below green, like red in particular, they see it as black. So if you have your garden full of lovely roses and begonias and petunias and all of these red flowers, your bees aren't going to see them. So there are no wild red flowers, poppies, but poppies open up, they're shallow flowers and there's ultraviolet lines going in. But most of the flowers that the the pollinators love are yellow ones, white ones, and blue ones in particular. I think they must be Clare fans or Roscommon fans. It's the blue and the yellow is what they like. So this is the kind of thing that you're trying to point out to people, that your natural near local environment should be managed in this way. This is a house down in Tipperary. I hope none of you watching own it. And there's somebody who really wanted to live in the countryside. And what's the first thing they did? Get rid of the countryside. So they bulldoze everything in sight and get rid of everything that's grown there. Talk about a scorched earth policy. So you'd wonder why people like that want to actually live in a rural area when the first thing they want to do is destroy everything else that's been a rural area. And this isn't just there. This is another one that I encountered in my Golden Mile judging. I think this one is in County Mead. And again, your scorched earth policy. Now, they'll say, oh, the council make you have an open driveway so you can see, and the councils do that. But no council asked you to get rid of your lawn. No council asked you to cut away all the other hedges. No council asked you to do the likes of either of those things, because there's not a tree around the house, there's nothing planted. You know, this is the kind of thing that appreciating your local environment really, really matters, because you can have your house like this or the house like the other one, and your local environment has been absolutely reduced, not by them, not by the county council, not by the government, but by the owners of that house and that site. You will go back to the other one to show you. I've gone the other way now. So that's the kind of thing. So here's Griffith Avenue in Dublin, a city of 1 million people, and there's Griffith Avenue with a wonderful vista, and you can see red marks on the trees here, because the people there are concerned to keep their trees. They don't want the street widened or bus lanes put in or whatever else, or if they are put in, it has to be done in some fashion that they won't lose their trees. So they're particularly incensed about this and making an effort to keep the natural environment that they have. And then, of course, I mean, we could talk about it all day, how you can improve your environment. And because it's National Tree Week, naturally, what else would I say? Only plant trees, plant more trees. Stop having your whole areas covered in grass. Grass is all fine and dandy, but you have to be mowing it. You have to be using fossil fuels to mow it. There's no flowers allowed. Things like dandelions are called weeds. It's a waste of space. So get rid of half the grass and put in things like we're looking at there. There's a little urban woodland being planted. So you, first of all, then, talking about your natural environment, you have to actually be aware of it, think it's every bit as important as the rainforest or the coral reefs. It's our forest, our coral reef, it's our natural environment. You have to appreciate how important it is, and then you have to make sure that it stays like that or gets enhanced or gets improved. And that's the whole concept of being aware of your local environment. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll see what questions we have, and I'll take answers or questions. So thank you very much for enduring. I don't think too many of you have left yet, so that's good. Grania.
Thanks a million, Eanna. That was very inspiring and really interesting. And there's definitely lots in there that was new to me. I have a couple of questions from the chat. And I suppose the first one is kind of a high level question. How do we get people to value their local natural heritage? Like you were mentioning at the start. It would make so much sense that it would mean people would protect it if they valued it, but how to make that leap? How do we make that leap? And I know, it's something that we come up in the trust against all the time, and it's the kind
of.
Well,
I could make a smart answer and say a lobotomy. Some people need a lobotomy; they'll appreciate it. But I could be equally smart and say something like COVID. But in fact, one of the things that has come out of this awful lockdown is the fact that people are now beginning to appreciate the 5 kilometers they're stuck with, because they're getting familiar with it. And that's the thing. We've had green schools, we've had the curriculum change since 1999. They all keep saying, oh, tell the children about it and that'll work. You learn it. The kids have been learning this in school for 20 years, but it's the fact now that the local environment is all we've got at the moment. That's, I think, the job of 20 years of education. Not that I'd wish it, but that's what has transpired, I would think.
Well, you've preempted my second question, or the second question from the chat here that I have, and that is, do you notice personally a change in biodiversity knowledge in children or teachers since the beginning of heritage in schools, for better or worse?
Well, I do and I don't, which is a terrible thing to say. In some places, they hire you as the wildlife specialist, and when you come, that's the day that they go out, and they wait till the specialist comes, and that's all they do. And that's not really what the Heritage Council was set up, or the Heritage in Schools was set up to do. But that's the exception, I suppose. In many cases, you're coming as the icing on the cake. The thing that has had a huge influence in schools are the green flags, the green flag projects that Antashka has run. And then you're coming to school for their green day. Then you're coming into the school to give them advice on their school garden. So that the teachers that are interested are having the experts, and there are more and more and more of heritage and school experts, I mean, until this year going out. So from that point of view, yes, there's more of that. But on the other hand, then there's probably, there's so many other things to teach in school. If I had my way, they'd be doing this all the time. So like everything else, there's probably people know more about wildlife and than when I was in school, when I wasn't on the curriculum at all. I mean, we had, when Dev, this famous Dev that did all the other things, the other thing he did was he changed the school curriculums so that there was much more time for Irish. So Tagalog Gaeilge got in it so that we can all speak Irish wonderfully because we learned so much in school, says she. But even though the other things were on the curriculum, there wasn't time to do art, there wasn't time to do PE, there wasn't time to do music, there wasn't time to do nature study because of the amount of time that had to be devoted to reading and writing and indeed the Irish language as well. So that has changed. Of course, the curriculums have all been improved. We have social SSE, social and scientific education. They have to go out field trips and that. So the curriculum has been reformed. So I think schools are getting it right. And and I'm glad to see that is happening. So I'd have to give that a guarded welcome and say, yes, schools have improved over the last 25 years, I'd say, no bother, yeah.
Very good, thank you. Mary, do you have a question?
Yeah, just one question here. Do our government agencies do enough to protect our natural heritage, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, it depends on who you're talking about, our government agencies, in a sense. I mean, give me an example of an agency that you're speaking of.
Well, it's not from me now, the question, sorry, I know it was...
Oh, sorry, you're just reading out one, yeah. I mean, the government agencies, I mean, they give out about culture, for example. And first of all, a government agency, or do you mean a semi-state body, or do you mean an NGO? I mean, people get all these things mixed up and they don't know which is what. We talk about local authorities. So local authorities do a huge amount of good work. But if they get something wrong, if they're cutting a hedge at the wrong time, well, they're excoriated. But all the good work to do is like the evil that men do live after them. The good is often interred with their bones. You do something wonderful, a wonderful program like this, and one person says it was great, and so one person saying praising is 1 in 1,000. One person complaining is 1 in 100. So I think there's far more attention given to things that people get wrong. I mean, Coillte have brought in Coillte Nature now. It's a section of Coillte, not the forestry division section that's planted for timber, but it's an amenity section, and they're restoring the Dublin mountain forests. There's no more citrus spruce going to be planted. They've been doing this for the last while, but all you still ever see is that Coillte are planting trees and bogs, even though they haven't done that in 40 years, and they have this whole Coillte Nature thing. So I think it is the nature of people to moan and complain and say everybody's getting it wrong when there's so much good being done. So I don't subscribe to this business that the government is doing it wrong. After all, we put them in place. If you don't like what they're doing, don't vote for them.
Fair
Very
point.
good. Yeah, fair point. Just one question is from somebody looking for advice on trees to plant in an urban setting. What website would you send them to, Eanna?
Well, I mean, speaking, says she modestly, we have the Tree Council of Ireland website, and in fact, I'm busy. I've just written, if you want to get I shouldn't be advertising, but if you want to get the mail on Sunday, we've done a brochure pull out for that. and the whole section on that is trees to plant in small urban gardens. But you're looking at small trees that'll grow, won't annoy the neighbours, things like spindle, things like holly, things like hawthorn, things like blackthorn. You know, they're lovely trees you can have in gardens. And indeed you can have things like pear trees, crabapple, hazel. All of these things will grow in your urban garden and indeed enhance. But don't be growing things like Scots pine or oak trees if you've only got a garden the size of 2 cars. That won't work.
It's a great point. Yeah.
The Tree Council website is the one to go to. Yeah.
I'm excited about that pull-out brochure in the mail on Sunday.
Yeah, get it. There's quite a few more questions, Grania. Will I pick a couple of more?
Yeah.
Okay. So would you have any tips regarding how we can see more wildlife on our 5-kilometre walks on country roads? So I'm not sure, are they asking how they can see more or how we can make the places more wildlife friendly to encourage more?
Well, I mean, wildlife have had a rough deal because they're not really very fond of humans. So, I mean, if you want to do bird watching or you want to do photography or something, you get up very early in the morning. I mean, we do the dawn chorus in May, and the dawn begins, you'll be delighted to know, at 4 a.m. And if you're up at 4 a.m, you have the birds singing, you have these foxes, you can smell all. But by the time the sun rises and it's 8 or 9 o'clock, they've all had a tither of it and gone home. They're not going to wait out to be, you know. So really, in a way, if you want to see more, you've got to go where it suits the wildlife rather than humans. But if you want to have more, you've got to make more habitat for them. You've got to put the hedges continuously. You've got to make sure your rivers aren't getting polluted. You've got to enhance the environment. And if you build it, they'll come, they say. So if you make your habitat suitable, the wildlife will actually come. Yeah. So improve your local environment and you will get your wildlife.
Great. Yeah, that's good advice.
I'm looking at a question here. Are we to get everyone living in towns and leave the rural parts to the factory farmers? No, this is typical. I never said that. What I said was anyone can live in a rural area if they live there lightly on the landscape. I'm not saying you can't do it. Did I say that? I did not. But what I pointed out was by having septic tanks that don't work, you're causing water pollution. Don't have septic tanks that don't work. I'm not saying don't live there. I'm just saying don't be doing that. Don't be building your house in the countryside and the first thing you do is a scorched earth policy and get rid of all the hedges. I showed you examples of that. But I didn't say don't live there. What I am saying is live there properly.